Welcome to Unhiding, the management podcast hosted by SquirrelNorth. Tune in to learn about leadership, management, and using the Kanban Method. Every episode is designed to provide you with pragmatic, proven, and actionable guidance. So let's get after it. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining. I'm James Steele, your host for this episode of Unhiding. Before I introduce you to today's guest, I want to tell you two things. One, exactly what you're going to get out of today's show, and two, why it's so important. First, you're going to hear from someone who saw an opportunity to improve business performance and went for it. He did something about it. You'll hear about the challenges he faced, the resistance he encountered, and how it was overcome. Now, secondly, I want to express why it's so important for you to hear this story. Many of you are looking for guidance that is practical, pragmatic, and proven. I get that learning this from coaches, consultants, and mentors is an important part of that process, but it's also essential that you hear from someone who actually did it. That's what today's show has to offer. So with me today, I'm very pleased to have as our guest, Richard Kishimoto. Richard is Director of Service Delivery at autoTRADER.ca, and I want you to hear his story about acts of leadership and using the Kanban method to improve service delivery. Welcome to the show, Richard.
Thank you, James.
I'd like to ask you, Richard, if we could start off by just setting a little bit of context. So if you could paint a picture of where you were. So we're talking about 1 year ago, and we'd like to develop some context for the listeners so that they have an understanding of where you found yourself, what situation you were in, and then after that, we'll get into some of the challenges you were facing. So if you could set a little bit of context for us, that'll help make sure that we're all on the same page for the rest of the show.
Sounds good. So I am the service delivery manager and director of delivery for a team that's focused on autoTRADER's dealer services portal. And we were going through a large transition period with our offerings. So we were moving from a product that was a shared offering to something that was a complete revamp from the ground up. It was a large undertaking. So all of our back-end systems and all of the UI as well and the UX that went along with it. We were about a year ago, we were approximately halfway through that undertaking. And it was a huge task, and the volume of work was really hard to decipher what was actually there. We had 3 teams within our dealer services service, and they were focused on different aspects of the product that we were building. And they were completely separate teams, focused on all of the different product features that were encompassed in their areas. And they were sort of separated by tech stack. When we ran in sort of a combination of Scrum and Waterfall, there was a high-level waterfall plan of what we needed to deliver and by when. That was very much driven by market conditions as well as some contractual obligations. But the team was very much trying to be as Scrum Agile as possible with set sprints, estimating via story points, everything that we're all familiar with. And the challenges we were having were definitely understanding everything that was happening, understanding progress. There, as I said, it was a really large undertaking. It was hard to quantify or correlate all of the individual tasks, user stories, up to the high-level features that were defined by the business and by our product management team. As well, understanding our capacity and how that related to estimates for the tasks that were somehow related back to that high-level plan of features, which were tied to a waterfall plan. It was a challenge to understand where we were at any given time. So, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, please continue.
So we started talking about what are the ways that we can understand what the team was doing and help our business stakeholders understand where we were. And the first step was getting our product team to be confident in knowing where we were at so that they were able to present to, we had a customer panel, a select group of customers that we would bring in and show them where we at, get feedback, as well as our executive team that wanted to touch base pretty regularly. So that was done primarily through just meetings between BAs and the product folks, as well as myself and the other delivery individuals, as well as having a UAT environments that anybody could go in and check out at any time.
Okay, great. So you have a service, you have some customers, sounds like you have around 3 teams. And what I'm hearing from you is a need for understanding what your work looks like,
Yeah.
right? And what the flow of that work looks like, and maybe understanding some of the metrics behind that, and trying to identify areas of opportunity for improvement.
Yeah, and one thing that I would add too is having a better understanding of dependencies. Those 3 teams worked really well and understood their domains very well, but weren't as in tune with each other. But everything they were building was part of one large system. So having an understanding of dependencies between each other was something that we really wanted to get as well.
Okay. And in terms of what you had tried before, so what were some of the things that you did? What were some of the challenges? Was there did you try things and they didn't work out, and was there appetite for yet another way of doing things, trying things in a new way? So maybe talk about just a little bit more about what you had tried, and then if you can bring it to a place of was there frustration, or was there a willingness to, yeah, let's try something new?
So, yeah, there definitely was an appetite to try something new. There was obviously an appetite to improve, and I think the main driver behind making things improve is to make our lives easier.
Right.
But there was an appetite to try new things, find a better way of understanding our work, understanding the work between the teams, and having a view that was digestible by everyone, even if it was a select level of detail. The first thing that we tried was taking all of the work that the developers were doing and tying them to something that was understandable at an executive slash customer level. So the common terms that we used was having all of the user stories and tasks. They needed to roll up into an epic.
Right.
So we used Jira, so that the framework was conveniently there, but the epic needed to be something that we could say to anybody that wasn't a developer, we're working on this feature.
Right.
We're putting together this car, and it didn't matter that there was somebody working on, the wiring harness, the steering wheel, putting cloth seats in. At the end, there was going to be a car. And once we were able to package all of the pieces of work into a feature, we put it in an Excel doc to begin
Right.
with, and we built out a view that showed, here are all of the features that we're working on. Here's, based on some of the estimates that we have, roughly how big they are relative to each other and what stages of completeness they're in.
Okay.
And that showed us that we had a lot of different features of varying size. It's pretty extreme, but it also showed us that we had a massive number of things that were all in some level of doneness, but
Right.
none of them were actually done. This was for a number of reasons. It was we would shift priorities based on upcoming dates, whether it would be presenting a certain feature for an upcoming customer panel, or
Mhm.
maybe it was having different resources become available, or losing those resources and making sure that we were able to use them most effectively. Or just wanting to close the gap based on whatever was happening in our market environment at that time. Um, and so that was something that we put together. It was then a view that we were able to speak to and use during our conversations about on progress and where we were at in the project. But it also clearly pointed out that there was room for improvement. Um, there was change needed to be able to at least say, well, we're going to start finishing these things.
Mhm.
And it allowed us to have a conversation about, well, which one do we finish first?
Right.
And that conversation was great and it got us started, but it didn't bring us to how are we going to start delivering these things.
Right.
The other thing that it brought to the surface was some of the dependencies between these features, and which were dependencies between the teams. For example, feature A may be blocked by the fact
Right.
that team B needed to contribute, but they were focused on feature F. Um, Having these three different teams that were chugging along with their different piles of work didn't necessarily, I hate to use the term, but we had many critical paths that were all hidden, and so we weren't addressing them. And that's kind of where we were when we started talking about what are the ways that we want to start fixing these things, and what avenues are out there and what approaches can we take.
Okay, great. So if what I'm hearing there is quite common in my experience as a consultant and a coach. So um, you're trying to develop an understanding of your work. You've tried various things. You mentioned, Scrum. You mentioned trying this spreadsheet, trying to get an understanding of the amount of work that you have in your system. Um, Maybe trying to understand some of those dependencies, realizing that you do have a lot of dependencies. Um, Also recognizing that you have an issue where you have a lot of work that's going on. You have some sense of, well, we have these cars or these things or these epics that we need to get done. And we have a lot of movement and everybody's busy, but maybe things aren't getting out the door or getting finished or accomplished as quickly as we would like. So a pretty common problem where everybody's really busy, but perhaps not as many things are getting done as we would like. Does that kind of accurately characterize some
Yeah,
of the
absolutely.
challenges?
For we're at a point where any given user story may be done, but a product wouldn't be ready to roll out. And the
Okay.
number of products we had at between 70 and 90% complete was a bit shocking.
Right.
So yeah, you're totally on the mark there.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, that sort of brings in this notion too of customer focus, right? Of
Yeah,
maybe we feel we're getting a lot of things done, but does the customer actually think that we're getting a lot of things done? Okay, great. So that gives us a feel, and sets the stage and develops a little bit of foundation for our listeners in terms of your context. What are some of the challenges? What are you seeing? What are some of the things that you would like to solve? Now, I would like to transition into some of the things that you actually did about it. And what did you learn about your work once you started trying new things like introducing the Kanban method? I'd also like to talk about some of the resistance or some of the challenges in implementing new ways of working and bringing about some changes. You mentioned that there was an appetite for change. There was some positive reception in terms of trying something new and trying to improve. So I think that's great, but I'd just like to dive into things a little bit more in detail and discuss what you did specifically about it.
yeah,
So,
definitely.
so I was thinking maybe asking you why Kanban and or how was it introduced?
So the way Kanban was introduced at Trader was um, we we were kind of stuck in a rut. So our senior leadership team decided to bring uh, in some consultants to look at where we were. A lot of the things that we were trying were we had utilized the entire toolbox we had,
Right,
and so it was time to get a new perspective on things. So we had the consultants come in. Our delivery team was trained in KMP1,
right,
and uh, I think it was actually the end of the day um, of our training. I went back to my desk with a couple of my delivery colleagues, and we commandeered a wall, and we threw all of our work onto the wall, every single thing that was in flight. Uh, and then we started pulling people in and saying, is this everything? And we started uncovering all of the hidden work that was happening. And then we kind of stared at it, a little scared for a bit,
yeah,
if I'm honest. Uh, and then we we worked with the consultants to understand um, what is our workflow really. Not what is it that we say we do, with well, have a grooming session, and then we have sprint planning, and then there's a sprint. What is actually happening? Where's all of these random requests coming from? Why did they come from? Understanding our sources of demand, not just as a backlog that product provides, but where the demand's really coming from. Who
right,
are our customers? Because it wasn't just a product team. One of the first things that was identified was our frontline support team. We weren't just building a product; we were supporting an existing product as well, and so a bunch of our capacity was going there, but we weren't acknowledging it properly. Um, the other thing that we did was when we created that board, we drew very distinct swim lanes for those three teams, and we brought in the tech leads from those teams. And there's a phrase that I remember very distinctly when we did that was one of the tech leads saying to the other, "I didn't know you were working on that."
Right.
And then the response being, but I didn't know you were doing it that way. And that really was pushed us to make a big leap into discovering where how are those teams operating differently, and the fact that our service was pretty fragmented. So then we, with the help of the the team that we brought in, we got all of the. We had a very large team, so we were only able to bring in the tech leads, the business analysts, the delivery team, and the product team. Brought them together for our first static session,
Right.
and we got even deeper into our workflow, and we talked a lot about dependencies and blockers.
So
Um,
I'd just like to step in there for one
sure.
second, just to make sure I got this clear for the listeners. So it sounds like, okay, so you decided you wanted to do something about this. You're going to go pursue some Kanban training. So you mentioned that you took KMP1. So KMP1 is the Kanban systems design class.
Yep.
So in terms of that training, did your whole team go? Was it everybody? Was it just a few select people? So who went to that training?
Uh, so for the KMP1 training, we brought in all of our delivery team. So all of the directors of delivery and project managers and delivery leads
Okay.
that we had. We also had some members of our senior leadership team. So our VP of delivery, our VP of engineering, they were involved. Unfortunately, they were being pulled away some of the time,
Right.
but those were the individuals that we started with.
Okay.
And really, the change needed to come from delivery in the environment that we have at Trader. We're responsible for the process. We owned the cadences in the Scrum world, and we were going to have to facilitate the change,
Right.
which I'm more than happy with, because our delivery team is I'm very proud of, in the fact that we're really receptive to trying new things,
Right.
and being open to new ways of doing things. And I don't think anybody in the delivery team thinks that we know best. There's always a new angle to approach things in. We're very collaborative. So taking the opportunity to get some new insight, was we were all more than eager to do that, and so that's where we started.
Okay, so all right, so you had all those people in the training. It sounds like they were eager, they were very motivated, they were very involved, they were very open to adopting some of the things that you learned in the training. You mentioned that you came out of the training. Sounds like you went over and almost right away you mentioned that you threw this board up kind of thing.
Yeah.
So you mentioned static. Now, static is the systems thinking approach to introducing Kanban, which is a set of workshops to help you develop a Kanban system. So when you say that you threw the board, did you go through static at this point, or was your first crack coming out of the training just applying what you had discovered in the training class, or did you go through the whole static process um, to develop your Kanban system?
So my my delivery colleague and I, we threw a board up really quickly, just
Okay,
on our own, before we did static, to just have a place to start.
right,
Uh, and part of that was due to the urgency of the project that we were in. Um, but very quickly we followed it with our static workshops.
okay,
And we then went back and did some fine tuning. Our first crack at it was incredibly basic. We knew things were in a backlog, and then we worked on them, and then we did some QA, and then we released them. So we kept
Right.
it pretty simple. But then when we did our static workshop, we found all the million other things that happened and tried to understand how those were going to fit into our day to day and how we manage the work. I think all of that happened in probably about 2 weeks.
Okay.
It was pretty quick.
Okay, that's really good feedback. That's interesting. So, and I'm an accredited Kanban trainer, and it's something I see quite often is people will come into training, right? They'll learn some new things. They'll leave that training. They're really excited. They want to apply some of this. And sometimes there can be a little bit of a rush to just, get something up and get something out of this training right away. But I think it's great that you recognize that and then took the time to, even if it's just a couple weeks, it can still happen pretty quickly. But to go through those workshops that are part of static and take the time to carefully look at, some of the things you want to improve on, what does your demand look like, and really take your time in terms of designing a proper Kanban system. So I think that was really a smart move on your part. In terms of characterizing and perhaps summarizing maybe a few of the aha moments or key things that came out of the static workshops for you, and maybe some of the challenges that came out of doing static is was there anything that was a challenge or any aha moments when going through the static process?
Absolutely. And um, so one of the I think biggest challenges was there was a tons of appetite from our product management team to make changes. They were in the same boat as us in delivery and development. In at that they were responsible for providing uh, products to our customers, and they were accountable to our executive team on making sure that those products were the right ones. But they relied on us to get work out. And while we worked together, we had different views on the work. And
Uh,
so when we started implementing change, be- because we did it quite rapidly, and the change wasn't just over that course of 2 weeks, it kept happening, kept happening, kept happening. Our product owners started to feel like they had less control over the work.
uh,
Um, Having sprint planning and grooming um, and being able to make decisions on what work we were doing pretty fluidly in the past, we sort of put up a wall in front of them and said, yeah, you can't do that anymore. We're
right.
limiting the amount of work that we're taking on. We're also not abandoning work anymore. And that was a pretty big shift in how product interacted with the work. The work was still there, but
Right.
they perceived that they had less control, and in some ways they may have had less control. Um, but we were shifting the focus from what do we need to do, what do we need to do today, to what do we need to deliver tomorrow. And we needed to support them in making them feel comfortable with the approach that we were taking. And one of the ways that we did that was al- coming to an agreement, and it took some negotiating, but
Right.
coming to an agreement on where, uh, at which point are they still allowed to change their minds or reprioritize work. And that point came in the in to do. As we agreed that as soon as we started work, we weren't going to change uh, whether or not
Right.
we were working on it. But up until the very last moment before a developer started working on things, something could be the most important and then become the least important in a day. We made that agreement with the product team because our market is changing rapidly. Um, it's there's new information at any given time. I mentioned our support team earlier, and they may have something that became crucial with no notice, and it needed to get put to the top of the pile.
Right.
And so that was one thing that we did, um, but it took us a little bit of time to get there, and it needed constant collaboration. And one of the things that we're able to, and again took time, but provide them with to make them or help them feel more comfortable was as we collected data for the metrics, we were able to show that if you put any given item at the top of to do,
Right.
as soon as we have space, we're a certain amount of with a certain amount of confidence you'll get it in X amount of time, and helping them to understand what is our true capability rather than just starting stuff. And at first it took a lot of just trust on a personal level between myself and the product director, and we had arguments, um,
Right.
and sometimes it just didn't go the way one of us wanted it to go. I lost some of the arguments, and we
Right.
had to start things. And very early on, it was hard to convince everyone that limiting the amount of things we were working on was the right thing to do. It wasn't until we gathered enough data to prove scientifically that we were doing the right thing. One phrase that I use quite often when this type of topic comes up is, I can't change math.
Right.
Math is a thing. It's quantifiable. It's observable, and I didn't make it up. I didn't fudge it. It is what it is. And the more and more we've been able to look back at that data and present it along with our our possible solutions to getting work done, the more and more understanding and collaboration we've gotten from especially our product team.
Okay, that's very interesting. So what I'm hearing from you is that coming out of your static sessions, one of your aha moments is sort of a success and a challenge was that you came out of there with some decisions coming out of the training, then coming out of the static workshops. It sounds like you made some decisions in terms of commitment points and what
Yeah.
it would take for work to get into your system and some of the policies around that. And that maybe some of that was a little bit uncomfortable for customers of your service who were maybe used to not having any sort of formalized replenishment. Right. So it was
Exactly.
just like, if we need this, we're just going to ask for it. We're going to walk over to your desk, whatever.
Yep.
Just, everybody's going to get on whatever it is we're asking for. So now we're starting to change that a little bit.
Yeah.
So it's a little bit of a stressor. But it sounds like one of the ways that you overcame that and you articulated it very well was to use data
Hmm.
to try and communicate an understanding that you developed of your actual capability so that you could give some really good reasons for why you were requesting that maybe there was some more formalized thought put into what are we going to start? When are we going to start it? And, let's not just have all of this irrefutable demand that's
Yeah,
coming in. Does that kind of accurately characterize the situation coming out of the training and out of
yeah,
static?
absolutely. And it's definitely the one thing that I would add is it was difficult at first because the data didn't exist. Any data that we had was rough around the edges
Okay.
at best, um, because the process wasn't representative of what the process we were trying to build was. So to kind of counteract that was to bring a little bit of compassion and
Okay.
understanding to the conversation. Um, yes, we are introducing stressors, but what understanding what this what um, I'm totally fading on the word. Let me start again. Not only were we introducing stressors, but really understanding what that stressor was hitting and what buttons was it pushing
Okay.
for those individuals. Was it um, well? I've been told this is the most important thing today, and but I'm also being told that I can't get any action on it, and so I'm stuck with a ticking time bomb.
Okay.
And and that was just like that was probably the most common example was I'm getting screamed at for getting this thing done and I'm being told I can't do anything with it. So being able to take on uh, some of that burden from the requesters was something that I did uh, pretty often at the beginning.
Okay.
Was don't I explained to a lot of people that don't feel like you have to go back to your customers and say that we just can't do it. Say that Richard has said we can't start this now, but we can probably start it soon or roughly in
Okay.
this amount of time. Um, but also start having conversations about is this something that is really worth expediting? But framing that conversation properly around expedite doesn't just mean it's super important. Expedite means let's look at everything. And is this one thing that you're holding more important than literally everything else?
Okay.
If you can make that decision and you can tell everybody else that that's the decision, great. I 100% support you. We're going to run it through. And helping all of our customers understand that that's how we were approaching work and that every piece of work was important in and of itself uh, was reassuring to people.
Okay, so that's another thing that's coming out of this that I'm hearing from you is that this wasn't just, we're going to come out of training, we're going to go through static, we're going to develop this Kanban system, we're going to visualize our work, we're going to have commitment points, and then we're going to put all these brand new rules, on our customers. It sounded like you were taking more of an approach of we're coming to a better understanding of our work. So now we're better equipped to have a conversation with you and give you options about what is the best way that you can leverage our capability. So, yes, we have the capacity to work on really urgent things, but let's be really thoughtful about what
Yeah,
might be urgent and what's not urgent and what could maybe wait a little before we get started. So it
yeah,
sounds like it was important to have a negotiation with the customers of your service and not just which I think is a very common mistake, is that I see a lot of people come out of static workshops and they build a Kanban system and they're like, hey, guess what? We have WIP limits now. We have capacity allocation. And I'm sorry, but we're at our WIP limit and we just can't take that work anymore. It really doesn't quite work that way in reality. It's important to develop and evolve the relationship with your customer so that they have an understanding of how to best leverage this new system that you've put in place for them.
Absolutely. We can't, no one can say uh, that our service is now best optimized for you, Mr. Customer, without having the conversation with the customer of, does this meet your needs? What are your real needs? In our case, it was, I need to understand the last possible moments that I can change my mind about what's important. And we
Right.
had a conversation. I need a way to deal with emergencies. We talked about how to expedite things. And I need a way to be able to report on where a given work item is. And we found different ways of managing that between uh, it- various status reports, as well as our physical board, which is replicated in Jira as on a digital board. So we were able to address that, but it took time. It took months of presenting something, implementing something, taking feedback, adjusting. We garbage stuff too. Uh, that one of the things that I would tell people is, do not paint your Kanban board on the wall,
Right.
because you will paint over it.
Okay. Yeah.
Um, it brings me to another aha moment, was coming out of static. We we implemented all the policies. Product had a handful of policies they wanted to implement. Developers did, tech leads did,
Hmm.
BAs did, uh, delivery had thoughts, and we all brought these things. And we saw within about a week, half of them were being ignored.
Okay.
And then a week later, half of those remaining ones were being ignored. So we reached the point where maybe two or two, it was just too much too fast.
Okay. That's a really good point. We're going to get into that for sure, talking about maybe some ways in which maybe there was some overreaching that was going on, or for striving for too much, or
Yep.
taking jumps that were a little bit too much. At this point, I'd like to ask, coming out of that training, now having a Kanban system, and looking back on things, could you possibly point to one or two of the Kanban practices, or maybe one or two of the principles that were really um, a key part of getting this thing off to a good start or getting the ball rolling? Was there anything that really stuck out to you that was of a particular importance in making things work?
The first one that jumps out is absolutely limiting work in progress. Um, I think when we first put our board up, our team of uh, 35, or sorry, our service of 35, 40 people had somewhere around 60 user stories
Okay.
in flight, somewhere between, they've been started and before they're ready for release. And a number of them had just stalled out for any number of reasons. And it's because we never looked at how many things are happening all at once, or if anything, looking at how many things are happening at once is, yeah, we're busy, we're doing work, but that's more than one thing per person. It was definitely, if you look at by discipline or what stage um, work was in, it was a number of things happening, and it was, people can't duplicate themselves. Once we started limiting work in progress, or we put the limits in and we flushed everything out, we then, well, first it was met with some frustration. People wanted to have their own ticket that they owned and they
Hmm.
could carry through. But once once people started working together on things, we immediately saw things flow through a lot quicker. There was a lot of satisfaction within the team of we're getting things done. They enjoyed working together, all of us did, and being able to collaborate on work. But we also saw an increase in quality
Okay.
because people's attention wasn't divided. Uh, our QA and our SDETs were able to work with developers from the inception of a ticket and all the way through to delivering it. Things just weren't being missed because they got triple the attention that they would had we not limited the work in progress. So also limiting work in progress prevented random requests appearing and being worked on. It wasn't perfect right from the get-go.
Hmm.
Um, there were still avenues that hadn't yet been uncovered for work to come in, but I would have said absolutely limiting work in progress was the most impactful thing we did right at the beginning alongside visualizing the work. Those two things together, were I to go to another organization or another service that hadn't implemented any parts of Kanban and used any systems thinking and needed a place to start to understand their work and improve their relationship with their work, those would be the two things I would start with immediately alongside training and understanding would be get air all the dirty laundry.
Yeah.
And now if it's the entire team needs to work on one thing at a time and then we work up from there, then that's where we start. I'm sure other people will not maybe agree with that, and they'd say maybe one thing per person and pare it down. But uh, I'd rather be safe and move up. But at any rate, it's that was definitely the thing that we saw the most benefit from.
So visualizing work and limiting WIP,
Yeah,
two key components of using results. Now, in terms of those two things, um, I'd like to discuss, did you encounter any resistance? Was there any uncomfortableness in visualizing some of this work, or um, was the team, or were there any individuals that were uncomfortable with, well, if we're not working on as many things, then maybe we won't get as many things done, or maybe I won't look as busy as I've looked in the past. So was there any sort of resistance coming from introducing some of these new practices?
yeah, definitely. In terms of visualizing the work, there wasn't much resistance there, with I think the one exception of, uh, but surely this is small enough that we don't even need to talk about it.
Mm.
Um, and it's understandable where people are coming from. If somebody comes by my desk and then it's going to take me literally 5 minutes, do we need to visualize that? And so there was a lot of discussion around that. Uh, but the points that I would keep coming back to is if I look at the board and I see that you are working on X, and then we find out you're actually working on Y, how do I communicate that out and support you in showing uh, what our team's capability is when I don't have a true reflection of what's actually happening. And sometimes those conversations still happen. We still
Hmm.
have people who are like, you know what, this is really small, we probably don't talk about it.
Okay.
And because it's not super surprising, but I still come back to, and it's actually caught people once or twice where somebody follows up and wants to know where's this particular work item, and it's a good question. So and so is working on it. Follow up. Oh, I haven't started it yet, but it shows on the board that you're working
Okay.
on it. Oh, but I took this other thing. I don't know where this thing is. So visualizing the work is hugely important, but it helping people understand the importance of it is requires different approaches, and sometimes I've experienced people just need to learn the hard way.
Right.
In terms of limiting WIP, the two biggest sources of resistance were from the team themselves, their biggest concern being, if I don't have a ticket with my name on it, am I going to be seen as a slacker?
Right.
Or am I going to, if I can't say I delivered X number of tickets, am I now a low performer? And ages ago, when we were all measured by how many sprockets we stamped out of sheet steel, that the logic, it makes sense. But now collaboration on complex work is way more important to me. And there's one example I can think of where one of the developers on our team, for a period of maybe 3-4 weeks, didn't write a single line of code. But they paired and code reviewed with 3 or 4 different
Right.
people over that period of time, and it was massively impactful and positive, and probably got us more work done because they didn't take more work on. And so yes, somebody who doesn't understand the thinking behind the system that we've implemented may look at and say, you know, Jeff and Bob aren't assigned to a ticket, or their names aren't attached, or I don't even see them. Surely they're not working, they're not contributing. It's not true. And so it was not just an adjustment for the developers and the other members of the team, but I also had to take that and communicate that out to the rest of the organization, and that don't look at the people, we are looking at the work. So as long as work's getting done, you don't need to know what's happening with the individuals. The other side of
No, go ahead.
the other side of limiting WIP and the resistance we had was definitely from in the early days from our customers and our stakeholders, especially when they did the simple math of, you've limited the number of items that can be worked on in your development phase to less than the number of developers you have on the team.
Okay, right.
And in that simple statement, it rationalizing that took a lot of conversation, especially with the customers and stakeholders who had not yet taken KMP1 or even TKP. And so first we got them trained with at least TKP, but also it did take, again, going back to trying to collect some data and showing, at this point we started limiting work and our throughput has gone up, or our quality has gone up, which was demonstrated with a number of different metrics, or things are just getting done faster. So there was resistance, and we were able to overcome it. That's not to say we don't revisit our WIP.
Hmm.
Sometimes the number isn't right based on a number of different factors, and we do have those discussions. One example was there was a period of a couple months where um, we had a front end developer who was constantly twiddling his thumbs because they we were our WIP was always used up. So
Right.
I drew a little post-it note that said +1 front end.
Okay.
That was his little bonus work that could come through, and it was some might say it's cheating, but I like to think of it as we used a
Okay.
system thinking approach to understanding our work and getting it through. Hold the debate for the comments on the podcast, but
Yeah.
um, uh, yeah. So that's
Yeah, that's
how we approach it.
some really interesting insight. And something that's very common is this notion that once you start visualizing your work, once you start doing things like limiting the amount of work in progress, that's going to act as a stressor that is likely to start introducing slack into your system, and that can be perceived by some people in a way that's uncomfortable,
Hmm.
in a way that they're not used to thinking about work. It's a shift from thinking about managing and measuring people more towards managing and measuring the flow of work. So it sounds like you encountered that level of resistance. It's something you're aware of, and it's something that you had to continue focusing on. So thank
Hmm.
you for that insight. I'd like to now shift into talking about some of the results that came out of um, introducing a Kanban system into your organization. So I'd like to first ask, how did you show progress? So your company invested in some training, you developed some Kanban systems, you started coming to an understanding of how your work works, you started establishing a new relationship with the customers of your service, and now you want to see, well, okay, so what are we getting out of this? So what approach did you take to demonstrating progress to both your stakeholders and to your customers?
So the first thing that we did was we started just crunching data, and we looked at the 6 months prior to introducing Kanban, and then looked at the key metrics that we wanted to focus on uh, for the period after we'd introduced it, and kept reflecting back. And it was some simple math, and there was it, again, it was a little rough around the edges looking at the period before introducing it, but the difference was so vast that it was clear that there was some improvement. But from that point on, we publish a report every 2 weeks that is available to everybody in our organization. But we do um, every month a service delivery review where we look back at what's what was done in the previous month, and what our lead times look like, how quickly we can deliver things, what our quality looks like. For us, that's measured by escaped defects, bugs that get introduced to our production environments and then are reported back to us. Either we catch them ourselves, or customers report them to us. uh, And as well, just looking at any issues that we had overall, whether it was any significant blockers that we had, like an environment goes down, which was one thing that we had to deal with, or dependencies with other services that needed to be managed. We look back on those and come up with ways that we're going to manage them. So, and we invite all of our customers, all of our stakeholders, and also the customers of other services, the leaders of the other services come to our service delivery reviews. And that's the primary forum that we have for talking about our capability, the quality of our service, and how we fit into the business, and are we doing the right things.
Okay, and in terms of involving everybody, so this um, obviously takes a lot of people involved in introducing this type of change. And you've already talked a lot about how you and your delivery leads and you are working with your customers to evolve your way of working and trying to make improvements. I'd like to ask, what if you were to try and characterize the role that leadership played in making this happen? So that could be acts of leadership from everybody. And I'm also interested in any thoughts you have in terms of leadership from executive. Um, so, what were there any key components? Did you have their buy in? Were they an essential part of things? Could you have done it without them? Were they involved? So, just maybe a few comments. If someone's thinking of embarking down a similar path that you took, what should they consider, and what was your experience in terms of acts of leadership and in terms of involving leadership?
So, it's a great question, and there's definitely sort of two halves to it. So, for myself and the delivery team, we were very fortunate that our VP of delivery and our chief digital officer were very supportive of this change, and they knew we couldn't just take some training and then everything was good. Um, we had the support of the consulting firm in with us for an extended period of time, which was sponsored by our senior leadership team. But they also check in with us regularly. So the
Mhm.
delivery team has actually a weekly meeting with our executive stakeholders where we discuss how we're doing from a delivery perspective. What are the challenges our services are having? What uh, experiments and improvements are we going to try and make? Why are we making those? What are the inter-service issues that we need to deal with? And they ask us questions. They challenge us on decisions that we make. It's so having the support, but also being pushed to make sure that we are doing the right things and trying new things and admitting when we're wrong, um, is is a huge help. But also them having the understanding of what we're doing and being involved and having the discussions with us, with our team members, and with the consultants as well, uh, is is hugely important. Could we have done it without their support? I don't think so. The key reason being that our customers and our stakeholders beyond our digital organization were used to communicating with us in a certain way. They were used to receiving results in a certain way, and they were used to talking about work in a certain way. All of that had to change for this evolution to be successful. And for people like myself to be implementing these changes and supporting the team in these changes, I wouldn't have been able to do that if I also had to focus my time on working with our customers and our other stakeholders on helping them understand. So we did benefit from having um, a protective dome around us for a period of time
Okay.
until we got to a point where I think the point where we were the dome started to go away and we started to be able to have those conversations ourselves is when we were able to have the data and we were able to fall back on the
Okay.
science and the
Yeah.
numbers and say, we know that you're uncomfortable or you may be dissatisfied right at this moment, but this is why and this is what we're doing about it. Number X is not what you expect it to be. This is what we're doing to directly address that. Whereas when we were first starting, we didn't really have that. Um, we didn't have that talk track. We didn't actually know exactly which lever we were going to pull, or if it was even a lever. Maybe it was a button or a dial.
Right.
We weren't there yet.
Understood. Yeah. Okay, great. Well, listen, I'd like to start wrapping things up now.
Sure.
First, I'd like to thank you very much for sharing your story. Um, my my feedback, my in listening to your story, understanding some of the challenges you face, being in the position you were in is not an easy position, right? You're faced with being responsible for a service, being responsible for developing a product. I'm sure a lot of people can relate for the type of situation you were in, being bombarded with training and then trying to come out of training with your delivery leads, implement these things, deal with the resistance that's going to come internally, and then balancing, you touched on it several times, balancing on this new negotiation, this new bargain that has to be struck with your customers is really no easy undertaking, but it's possible. It's The Kanban method often talks about approaching this type of change in an evolutionary way. We've had a quick conversation about all of this stuff, but ultimately, we're talking about something that happened over the time frame of about a year. So take small steps. It sounds like you did that. It sounds like you yourself demonstrated some really great acts of leadership. It sounds like you have the support of your leadership. You mentioned your CDO, you mentioned your VP of service delivery, you mentioned your team several times. So kudos to all of you for coming out of this training and taking your time with things, being respectful of people. You mentioned having empathy. You mentioned involving your team. So I just want to commend you and thank you for doing those things. And it sounds like you're getting a lot of success out of this. You talked about some of the positive outcomes that you were getting. But before we sign off, I'd like to ask you: do you have three key takeaways or a few key takeaways, pieces of advice for the listeners of the podcast if they were to find themselves in your position? Right, they have some challenges, they're trying to improve their way of working, they're thinking about adopting the Kanban method. You've tried this for about a year, you've had a lot of success with it. So what would your advice be to the listeners who are thinking about maybe trying some of this?
For sure. First, thank you for your kind words. A few things that I I would suggest the what we just touched on is definitely trying to involve as much of the leadership team in the adoption as possible. At the very least, ensuring that the same language is being spoken and understood so that as changes are being made at the service level, the context isn't lost.
Mm-hmm.
Making evolutionary change and not having that sound like just sort of a fluffy thing, but actually, no, we're making incremental and scientifically, deciphered changes based on data that we're taking. And uh, also in working with the as much of the leadership team as possible is aligning on the problems that you're trying to solve, but not just the symptomatic problems, but the root cause of those problems. I think it's probably really easy to start understanding what lead times are and then focus on just lowering or lead times or
Okay.
increasing throughput, but not understanding where what is causing those symptoms. And it comes back again to understanding the work. So, in summary, involving leadership to a point of organizational alignment
Okay.
on what the issues are, and um, at the if even if they can't be involved to every minute detail of the improvements that are trying to be made, they can understand why those changes, why those steps are being taken to get their support and have that protective dome if it's necessary. I would also keep an open mind. Just mentioned experimenting. Um, be prepared to get it wrong. I mentioned we implemented a ton of policies and saw really quickly they fell apart. And
Yeah.
it could have been easy to just get discouraged and say, well, policies don't work, throw them out the window.
Okay. Yeah.
But I posed the question to the team, and it was during stand up of all times. We're running through the board and talking about, well, how did this get here? Because these policies, and it came out that there's too many, so we just don't look at them. A little frustrating. But then the team themselves actually said, you know what, this is the one really important thing that we should do. If we implement that policy, it's actually going to address these problems. And they approached it from their perspective and their understanding of the workflow. And so I just said, cool, do it. And once they did, it solved a lot of problems.
Okay.
So it was acts of leadership from the team themselves, which I fully support. But it was also, we tried something, we got it wrong. We tried something different, and it worked. So I think keeping an open mind and be willing to fail, document the failure, learn from it.
Mm-hmm.
It's I think we talk about it through both KMP1 and KMP2 about that we're using a lot of scientific method here, and so it applies to everything that you're going to do introducing Kanban. And there's going to be more to it than you expect when you set out, but the more you keep digging, the more gold there's going to be in there. And the last thing, and it kind of touches back on what problems are you trying to solve, is their workflows and numbers are only part of the Kanban toolkit. The science of how you look at your work, how you look at your services, how you talk to your customers and your business, it's as big or as small as you want it to be. So yeah, don't get caught up on the one thing. One of the things that I really took to heart from KMP2 was looking at system 1 and system 2 thinking. And that's really goes back to what I was kind of just felt in my gut, but once we talked about it in the class, really started to really click was having some empathy to that system one thinking of where people were being threatened and the changes that we were making, and trying to cradle the system one side of things while educating and collaborating with the system two side of people that I needed to work with. I think that's key.
That's great. So summarizing on your takeaways, then it sounds like involve leadership, encourage acts of leadership amongst everybody. It's going to be really challenging to get to where you want to be without that. Be open-minded. We're trying experiments. Involve everybody. Don't, have a specific, define, plan, solution, grand gesture. Yep. This is exactly what we're going to accomplish. And number 3 is really understand that we're dealing with people. We're dealing with emotions. We need to be aware of that, and we need to constantly keep that in mind. Thank you very much for taking the time to meet with us, and we wish you the best.
Thanks very much. Pleasure.
That brings us to the conclusion of this episode of Unhiding. Please have a look at the show notes for information about the training, consulting, and coaching mentioned during the show. On behalf of the entire team at SquirrelNorth, I want to thank you for spending time with us. I'd also like to invite you to please subscribe to our podcast and join us for future discussions about leadership, management, and the Kanban Method.